Right now, as you're watching this, approximately 43 million Americans are carrying federal student loan debt. Combined with private loans, the total sits at roughly 1.87 trillion. That's trillion with a T. It's the second largest category of consumer debt in the entire country, sitting right behind mortgages and ahead of auto loans and credit cards combined. The average federal borrower owes just under $40,000, and for many people, that number will define the next 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years of their financial lives. It shapes where they live, whether they buy a house, when they start a family, and how they plan for retirement. But here's the thing that should really make you stop and think. For the vast majority of American history, none of this existed. There were no federal student loans, there was no Sallie Mae, there was no checkbox on a financial aid form that quietly committed an 18-year-old to decades of repayment. The entire concept of borrowing money from the government to attend college is barely 60 years old. Before 1965, the federal government had almost no direct role in lending money to students. And before 1958, federal student loans didn't exist at all. Not in any form. Zero. And yet, people still went to college, they still earned degrees, they still built careers and contributed to one of the most powerful economies the world has ever seen. So, the obvious question is, how did they do it? How did Americans afford college in a world where student loans simply weren't a thing? The answer to that question reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the system we have today. Because when you trace the full arc of this story, from the founding of America's earliest universities to the moment student debt became a national crisis, what you find is not just a history of education, it's a history of political decisions, economic incentives, Cold War paranoia, and a fundamental philosophical shift in how this country thinks about knowledge, opportunity, and who deserves access to either one. Let's go back to the very beginning. In the 1600s and 1700s, colleges in America were not what we think of today. They were small, exclusive, and overwhelmingly religious in their mission. Harvard was founded in 1636, just 16 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. Its primary purpose was to train ministers for the Puritan clergy. William and Mary followed in 1693. Yale came along in 1701. These institutions were not built for the public. They were built for the sons of wealthy colonial families, for young men whose futures were already more or less guaranteed by birth. The idea that a farmer's child or tradesman's son would attend one of these schools was for the most part unthinkable, and cost was only part of the reason. The bigger barrier was cultural. In colonial America and well into the 1800s, most people didn't need a college degree. The economy ran on agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. You learned what you needed from your family, your community, or through apprenticeship. College was a luxury reserved for a tiny sliver of the population. By the early 1900s, only about 5% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 21 were attending college. 5%. That's a staggeringly small number compared to today, where roughly 60% of high school graduates enroll in some form of higher education. Now, here's what made this early system work without student loans. First, tuition was remarkably low, even by the standards of the day. Many early colleges were funded by religious denominations, private donors, and later by state governments. The University of Missouri, for instance, charged zero tuition in 1900. Dorm rooms cost between $12 and $28 per year, even at the more expensive private institutions. Annual costs were manageable for the small number of families who actually sent their children. And second, the students who attended were overwhelmingly from families that could already afford it. There was no need for a massive lending infrastructure because the system wasn't designed to serve everyone. It was designed to serve the elite. And for that narrow purpose, it worked just fine. But then something changed, and it started not with education policy, but with a war. Actually, it started with a man named Justin Smith Merrill, a congressman from Vermont who in 1862 convinced President Abraham Lincoln to sign one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American educational history. It was called the Merrill Land Grant Act, and what it did was revolutionary. The law granted each state 30,000 acres of federal land for every member of its congressional delegation. The states could develop or sell that land, and the proceeds would be used to establish public colleges focused on agriculture and the mechanical arts. The idea was radical for its time. Higher education had always been the domain of the privileged. Merrill wanted to create a system where the children of farmers, mechanics, and laborers could access a practical education that would help them build better lives. And it worked. The Merrill Act gave rise to some of the most important universities in the country. Iowa State, Kansas State, Cornell, Rutgers, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Nebraska. These weren't finishing schools for aristocrats. These were institutions built for the working class. They were funded not by tuition revenue, but by public land and public investment. A second Morrill Act in 1890 expanded the program and crucially required that states either admit students regardless of race or establish separate institutions for black students. This led to the creation of 17 historically black colleges and universities, including Tuskegee University. The land-grant system formed the backbone of American public higher education, and for decades it kept costs extraordinarily low. Many state universities charged little to no tuition well into the 20th century. The principle was simple. Education was a public good. Society benefits when its citizens are educated, and therefore society should bear most of the cost. So, how did individual students manage the expenses that did exist? Because even when tuition was free, or nearly free, there were still costs. Room and board, books, transportation, the opportunity cost of not working full-time. The answer is that in the era before student loans, Americans used a combination of strategies that, taken together, made college accessible without debt. The first and most common was simply working. Not working part-time while attending school full-time, the way many students do today, but genuinely working their way through college. This was possible because tuition was low enough that a summer job or part-time position during the school year could cover a meaningful share of the costs. In the 1920s and 1930s, a year at a state university might cost a few hundred in total. At the same time, an average worker could earn $700 to $1,000 per year. It wasn't easy, but it was mathematically possible to earn your way through school without borrowing a dime. Many students took jobs on campus. They worked in dining halls, libraries, and maintenance crews. Others picked up seasonal work during the summer, saving every dollar for the next academic year. Some took a year off between high school and college specifically to work and save. The culture around this was completely different from what exists today. Working your way through college wasn't seen as a hardship or sign of disadvantage. It was expected. It was normal. It was, in many ways, part of the educational experience itself. The second strategy was family support. In the decades before student loans, families who sent children to college were, by and large, families who had been saving for years or who could absorb the cost from their regular income. This wasn't always the case, of course. Many families simply couldn't afford to send their children to school, and those children didn't go. The system before student loans was not some golden age of universal access. It was a system that worked well for those who could participate and excluded millions who could not. But for the families who did send their children, the costs were proportionally much more manageable than they are today. In the 1950s, annual tuition at many public universities was between $200 and $500. Room and board might add another $500 to $900. On top of that, total costs for a year of college at a state school were often under $1,000. To put that in perspective, the median household income in 1950 was around $3,300. So, a year of public college might cost roughly a quarter to a third of a family's annual income. Today, the average cost of attending a public 4-year university, including tuition fees, room and board, is over $22,000 per year, while median household income hovers around $80,000. The ratio has shifted dramatically, and that shift is a major reason why the old model broke down. The The third strategy was scholarships and institutional aid. Even before the federal government got involved, colleges and universities offered their own financial assistance programs. Harvard, for instance, created one of the earliest known student loan funds in 1838, a small lending program administered directly by the university, not by the government. Many schools offered merit-based scholarships to attract talented students, and some provided need-based aid funded by endowments and private donations. Religious organizations, civic groups, and local businesses also sponsored students. It was common for a church or Rotary Club to fund a promising young person's education, especially in small-town America, where the community had a vested interest in seeing its brightest members succeed. These sources of support were patchwork and uneven. They didn't cover everyone. They certainly didn't address the systemic barriers that kept women, Black Americans, and other marginalized groups out of higher education for decades. But within their limitations, they helped a significant number of students attend college without taking on debt. Now, all of these strategies worked in a world where college was relatively inexpensive, where the student population was relatively small, and where the economy didn't require a degree for most well-paying jobs. But that world was about to change. And it changed because of something most people don't associate with education at all. It changed because of war. On June 22, 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. At the time, 16 million American soldiers were returning from the Second World War, and the government was terrified of what would happen if they all flooded the job market at once. The memory of the Great Depression was still fresh. The bonus Army March of 1932, when World War I veterans had camped out in Washington demanding their promised benefits, was a cautionary tale that haunted policymakers. The GI Bill was designed to prevent a repeat. It offered returning veterans a package of benefits that included tuition assistance, a living stipend, lowest home loans, and unemployment insurance. For education specifically, veterans could receive up to $500 per year for tuition, which at the time was enough to cover the full cost of almost any college in the country, including Harvard, where tuition and room and board in 1945 averaged around $525. The impact was seismic. Before the war, college had been an option for maybe 10 to 15% of young Americans. University campuses were known as havens for the most privileged classes. But when the GI Bill went into effect, millions of men who had never imagined themselves as college material suddenly had the financial means to attend, and they flooded in. By 1947, veterans made up nearly half of all college students in the country. By 1950, almost 500,000 Americans graduated from college in a single year, compared to just 160,000 in 1939. The number of university degree holders in the United States more than doubled between 1940 and 1950. The GUI Bill didn't just change who went to college, it changed what college was. Campuses that had been sleepy, elitist institutions were suddenly overwhelmed with students from every walk of life. Overcrowded classrooms prompted massive construction projects. New dormitories, lecture halls, and research facilities went up across the country. The modern American university system, the sprawling, diverse, research-intensive model we know today, was essentially born in this moment. And here is a detail that often gets overlooked. The GI Bill was not a loan program, it was a grant program. Veterans didn't borrow money to go to school, the government paid for it. The cost was seen as an investment in national stability and economic growth, and by virtually every measure, it paid off spectacularly. The GI Bill is credited with creating the post-war middle class. The veterans who earned degrees went on to become engineers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners. They bought homes in the suburbs. They raised families. They drove an economic expansion that lasted 30 years. Over 50 years, more than 20 million veterans and dependents used the educational benefits for a total federal investment of $67 billion. And the return on that investment, in terms of tax revenue, Economic productivity and social stability dwarfed the initial cost many times over. But there was a dark side to the GI Bill that cannot be ignored. While the law itself did not explicitly discriminate by race, its implementation was left largely to state and local officials, many of whom did discriminate. In the South especially, black veterans were systematically steered away from four-year universities and toward vocational programs or underfunded black colleges. Banks refused to approve home loans for black veterans in white neighborhoods. The Veterans Administration often looked the other way. So, while the GI Bill transformed the lives of millions of white veterans and their families, its benefits were distributed unevenly along racial lines. This is an important part of the story because it foreshadows a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the history of American higher education financing. The systems that were created to expand access often ended up reinforcing existing inequalities, even when that wasn't the stated intent. Now, the GI Bill proved something important. It proved that when the government invested directly in education, the results were overwhelmingly positive. But it was designed as a one-time program for a specific population. It wasn't a permanent solution to the question of how ordinary Americans would pay for college. And by the late 1950s, that question was becoming urgent for a new reason entirely. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit. It was a small metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, beeping its way across the sky. But its psychological impact on the American public was enormous. The United States, the country that had won the war, split the atom, and rebuilt Europe, had been beaten to space by its Cold War rival. The reaction in Washington was immediate and intense. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, what else could they do? The fear was that America was falling behind in science and technology, and the blame landed squarely on the education system. The response came in 1958 with the National Defense Education Act, or NDEA. The name itself tells you everything you need to know about the motivation. This wasn't framed as an education policy, it was framed as a national security measure. The law created the first federally backed student loan program in American history. It was called the National Defense Student Loan Program, and it provided loans of up to $1,000 per year with a total cap of $5,000. The interest rate was 3%, and repayment was spread over 10 years after graduation. There was even a forgiveness provision. Teachers who taught for 5 years could have 50% of their debt cancelled. But the program was narrowly targeted. It was only available to students studying engineering, science, mathematics, or education fields that were deemed critical to national defense. The loans were distributed through colleges, which were required to match a portion of the federal funding. So this was not a universal loan program. It was a strategic investment in specific fields that the government believed were essential to winning the Cold War. And then came 1965, and this is where the story really turns. On November 8, 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson stood in a packed gymnasium at his alma mater, Southwest Texas State College in San Marcos, Texas. The ceremony was supposed to take place in front of Old Main, a building that Johnson had cleaned as an undergraduate janitor. But rain forced the event indoors. It didn't matter. What Johnson signed that day would reshape American higher education forever. It was called the Higher Education Act, and it was part of Johnson's ambitious Great Society legislative agenda. A sweeping set of programs designed to fight poverty, expand civil rights, and level the playing field for disadvantaged Americans. Johnson knew poverty firsthand. He had grown up in the Texas Hill Country in a family that struggled to make ends meet. He credited his college education with lifting him out of that poverty, and he was determined to give others the same chance. The Higher Education Act created the first broad-based federal student loan program, the Guaranteed Student Loan Program. Unlike the NDEA loans, which were limited to specific fields, these loans were available to students regardless of their major. The idea was modeled after a state-run program in Massachusetts, and it worked like this. Private banks would issue the loans. The federal government would guarantee repayment, meaning if a student defaulted, the government would cover the loss. For qualified students, the government would also subsidize the interest, making the loans much cheaper than anything available on the private market. The law also created grants for low-income students, institutional aid for colleges, and a national teacher corps. Johnson described the legislation as opening a new door for the young people of America. And in many ways, it did. But what Johnson and the lawmakers of 1965 could not have foreseen was that they had also opened a door to something else entirely. They had created the architecture for what would eventually become a $1.87 trillion crisis. Now, to be fair, the Higher Education Act didn't cause the student debt crisis on its own. The crisis was the product of decades of policy choices, economic shifts, and institutional behaviors that compounded over time. But the Act laid the foundation by establishing a principle that would prove enormously consequential. Instead of funding education directly, the way the GI Bill had done, the government chose to fund students indirectly through loans. The difference sounds subtle, but it was everything. When the government pays a university directly, it has leverage to control costs. When the government gives students money to pay universities, universities have every incentive to raise their prices because they know the money will keep flowing regardless. This dynamic, what economists would later call the Bennett hypothesis after Ronald Reagan's education secretary William Bennett, who articulated it in the late 1980s, would become one of the central drivers of tuition inflation. But in the immediate aftermath of the Higher Education Act, none of this was obvious. Tuition was still low. State governments were still funding their public universities generously, and the loan amounts were small enough that most borrowers could repay them without much difficulty. The system worked more or less through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. In 1972, the Higher Education Act was amended to create Basic Educational Opportunity Grants, later renamed Pell Grants, which provided direct financial aid to low-income students. The same year, Congress established the Student Loan Marketing Association, better known as Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae was created as a government-sponsored enterprise to provide liquidity to the student loan market. In plain terms, it bought student loans from the banks that issued them, freeing those banks to make more loans. It was supposed to be a mechanism for expanding access, but over time, Sallie Mae evolved into something very different. It became a profit-driven entity, and its interests began to diverge from those of the students it was supposed to serve. The creation of Sallie Mae also had an unintended but profound effect. It commodified student debt. Student loans were no longer just a tool for individual students. They were financial instruments that could be bought, sold, and traded. They were assets on a balance sheet, and once debt becomes an asset to someone, that someone has a financial interest in making sure more of it gets created. Then came the 1980s, and this is where the trajectory of American higher education took a sharp and, many would argue, irreversible turn. When Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California in 1966, he was openly hostile to the University of California system. Student protesters at Berkeley had become a symbol of the counterculture, and Reagan campaigned on a promise to crack down on what he called the mess at Berkeley. His education advisor, Roger Freeman, made a remarkably candid statement to the San Francisco Chronicle. He said, and I want you to really sit with this, that the country was in danger of producing an educated proletariat. He argued that society had to be selective about who was allowed to go through higher education. Reagan won the governorship and immediately pushed to end free tuition at California's public universities, something that had been a defining feature of the state's educational system for decades. In 1968, California residents paid a $300 yearly fee to attend Berkeley. That was the equivalent of roughly $2,000 today. Today, tuition at Berkeley exceeds $15,000, with total annual student costs approaching $40,000. Reagan's policies in California became a template that spread across the country. When he became president in 1981, he brought the same philosophy to the federal level. During his first term, spending on higher education and federal student aid was slashed by 25%. Pell Grant funding effectively flatlined, failing to keep pace with rising costs. Meanwhile, the total volume of guaranteed student loans expanded dramatically. The shift was profound and deliberate. The government was moving from a model based on grants, which didn't need to be repaid, to a model based on loans, which did. The message was clear. Higher education was no longer a public good that society had a responsibility to fund. It was a private investment that individuals should finance themselves, even if that meant going into debt. This was not a minor philosophical adjustment. It was a fundamental reimagining of the social contract around education. For over a century, from the Marrell Act to the GI Bill to the expansion of state university systems, the governing principle had been that education benefits everyone and should therefore be supported by everyone. Reagan's policies flipped that principle on its head.
Education in this new framing benefits the individual who receives it, and therefore that individual should bear the cost. And the costs started rising fast. With students now armed with government-backed loans, universities realized they could charge more. With state funding being cut, they had to charge more. Administrative bloat compounded the problem. From roughly 1990 to 2012, administrative density at American universities roughly doubled, and administrative spending per student increased by about 60% in real terms, outpacing growth in instructional spending. Universities built lavish recreation centers, luxury dormitories, and sprawling athletic facilities, not because students needed them to learn, but because they helped attract applicants in an increasingly competitive enrollment marketplace. The arms race in amenities was funded directly and indirectly by student loans. Every new climbing wall and lazy river represented dollars that students would be repaying with interest for years after graduation. Then came the Middle Income Student Assistance Act of 1978, which expanded federal loan eligibility to middle and upper income families. Then came the creation of Parent Plus loans in 1980. Then came unsubsidized loans in 1992, which allowed students to borrow regardless of financial need, with interest accruing from the moment the loan was disbursed. Then came tuition tax credits in 1997. Each of these changes was presented as an expansion of access, and each of them was. But each one also pumped more money into a system that had very few mechanisms for controlling how that money was spent. And then, in the early 2000s, something happened that supercharged the whole machine. The George W. Bush administration made it significantly easier for online education programs to access federal financial aid. This opened the floodgates for for-profit colleges. Institutions like the University of Phoenix, DVRY, and ITT Tech saw their enrollment explode. Between 2000 and 2010, enrollment in private for-profit institutions increased by 329%. These schools marketed aggressively to vulnerable populations, including low-income students, single parents, and veterans. They promised career-ready credentials and high-paying jobs. But the reality was often very different. At their peak, for-profit colleges accounted for a little more than 10% of all enrollment, but they consumed roughly a quarter of all Pell Grants, a third of all student loans, and produced more than half of all defaults. They were siphoning enormous amounts of federal money while delivering outcomes that were, in many cases, worse than if the students had never enrolled at all. Then came the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. As the economy cratered, millions of Americans lost their jobs or saw their incomes plummet. Many of them went back to school, hoping that a degree would give them a better shot in a tight labor market. Enrollment surged, borrowing surged, and at the same time, state governments facing their own budget crisis made devastating cuts to higher education funding. Between 2008 and 2018, state funding for 2- and 4-year public colleges dropped by over $7 billion. To compensate, public universities raised tuition. The students borrowing to pay that tuition were taking on more debt than ever before.
often for degrees that no longer guaranteed the kind of employment that would make repayment manageable. Und damit schließt sich der Kreis. Doch was blieb nach diesem radikalen Experiment? Was waren die direkten Folgen und warum blicken wir heute, Jahre später, mit genau diesem analytischen Blick auf jene Ereignisse zurück? Was es veränderte. Die unmittelbaren Konsequenzen dieser Offenlegung waren weitreichender, als es die damaligen Kritiker und selbst die optimistischen Befürworter erwartet hatten. Der Paradigmenwechsel in der Kommunikation. Das Monopol auf Deutungshoheit und exklusive Informationsvergabe wurde nachhaltig gebrochen. Es zeigte sich, dass eine dezentrale Struktur in der Lage ist, narrative Kontrollstrukturen zu umgehen und Fakten direkt an die Öffentlichkeit zu spiegeln. Die institutionelle Reaktion. Behörden und Organisationen weltweit mussten ihre internen Sicherheitsarchitekturen komplett überdenken. Was als technisches Leck begann, wurde zur Blaupause für die Debatte über Datensicherheit, Quellenschutz und die Macht von Whistleblowern im digitalen Zeitalter. Das Bewusstsein der Öffentlichkeit. Der Begriff der Informationsfreiheit bekam eine neue, schärfere Kontur. Die Frage, wer welche Informationen besitzt und wer das Recht hat, sie der Allgemeinheit vorzuenthalten, wurde von den Feuilletons in die Wohnzimmer und Hörsäle getragen. Warum es heute wichtig ist. In einer Zeit, in der synthetische Medien, automatisierte Desinformation und algorithmische Filterblasen unseren Alltag prägen, wirkt dieses historische Beispiel wie ein seismografischer Testlauf. Wer die Kontrolle über die Primärquellen verliert, verliert die Kontrolle über die Erzählung. Dieser Satz, den Beobachter der damaligen Vorgänge oft zitierten, hat heute mehr denn je Gewicht. Die Mechanismen, die damals erprobt wurden, spiegeln sich in den heutigen Debatten über Transparenzgesetze, Open Source Intelligence und die Integrität digitaler Archive wider. Es geht längst nicht mehr nur um die damaligen Akteure, sondern um das fundamentale Vertrauen in digitale Infrastrukturen und die Verlässlichkeit dessen, was wir als Wahrheit akzeptieren. Wo die Materialien freigegeben wurden. Für alle, die sich selbst ein Bild machen wollen, die Primärquellen prüfen und die Rohdaten analysieren möchten, stehen die verifizierten Dokumente und Datensätze auf den etablierten Plattformen für offene Daten und Transparenz zur Verfügung. Zentrale Repositorien. Die vollständigen Archive, chronologisch sortiert und mit den entsprechenden Prüfsummen versehen, sind über die bekannten dezentralen Serverstrukturen abrufbar. Open-Access-Datenbanken. Historiker und Journalisten haben die Rohdaten in durchsuchbare, wissenschaftlich begleitete Portale eingespeist, um eine unabhängige Aufarbeitung zu garantieren. Rechtliche Hinweise. Die Freigabe erfolgte im Rahmen der geltenden Bestimmungen zur Veröffentlichung von Dokumenten von öffentlichem Interesse, wobei sensible Personendaten anonymisiert wurden, um den Schutz Einzelner zu wahren. Der finale Kader aus der Quelle. Am Ende eines jeden solchen Prozesses stehen nicht nur die Akten und die theoretischen Debatten, sondern die Menschen, deren Entscheidungen das Gefüge geformt haben. Die finale Dokumentation aus der Primärquelle listet die Kernakteure wie folgt auf. Name/Funktion in der Quelle. Rolle im Prozess, Status nach Abschluss. Projektleitung und Koordination. Strategische Steuerung der Veröffentlichung und juristische Risikoprüfung. Im Fokus internationaler Beobachtung, Fortführung der akademischen und publizistischen Arbeit. Technische Infrastruktur. Sicherstellung der Datenintegrität und Aufbau der dezentralen Spiegelserver. Anonymisiert im Hintergrund. Wegbereiter für kommende Open-Source-Projekte. Rechtlicher Beistand. Verteidigung der Quellenschutzrechte und Begleitung der medienrechtlichen Schritte. Aktiv in der juristischen Aufarbeitung von Informationsfreiheitsrechten. Wissenschaftliche Begleitung. Analyse, Einordnung und historische Kontextualisierung der Rohdaten. Veröffentlichung von Studien und Kompendien zur Medienethik. Das Fazit bleibt eindeutig. Es war kein einmaliges Ereignis, sondern der Auftakt zu einer dauerhaften Auseinandersetzung darüber, wie wir mit Wissen, Macht und Öffentlichkeit im 21. Jahrhundert umgehen. Die Akten sind geschlossen, Doch die Fragen, die sie aufwarfen, bleiben offen.